Well, before I get into the monologue, I thought I'd say welcome back and hope you had a very Merry Christmas. If you listened to the special that I did with David Starkey and Tessa Dunlop on Christmas Day, you'd know that the medieval people had 12 days of celebration and we're only 3 days into it. So I hope you enjoy the next 9 days as well. But let's hope we can have bigger celebrations later into next year with the budget on the 6th of March on inheritance tax. Because inheritance tax is a pernicious and bad tax which ought to be scrapped. Why? Not because you've been taxed twice. Actually, in many ways, you're taxed twice on lots of things. When you go shopping and you pay VAT, you're paying tax a second time on money that you earned, on which you've paid income tax. So I don't think that's the strongest argument. The reason inheritance tax is such a bad tax is because of its economic consequences. It leads to the misallocation of capital, and that undermines economic progress and investment. Why and how? Well, because people are worried about inheritance tax, they invest in things that they know will be limited in their inheritance tax burden. So instead of buying, for example, a FTSE 100 company, they will buy a small company, because a FTSE 100 company always is liable to inheritance tax if you're over the threshold, whereas a small company may be exempt. You see the same with farmland. Farm businesses and farmland within them is inheritance tax free. But if you own a house or a property that's built on something that was farmland, it's not. So you distort the investment, and you also encourage people to hold on to investments that they'd otherwise be better off selling and reallocating the capital. Why is that? Well, because of the combination of capital gains tax followed by inheritance tax. If you are elderly and you have an asset, an investment that in the accountant's phraseology is pregnant with gain, you don't want to sell it because you'll pay 20% or potentially 28% on the capital gain, and then if you die the next day, you'll pay 40% on inheritance tax. And this means that you hold on to weak investments rather than realizing the gain and putting it into a new and better investment. And what economic consequence does this have? It means that money is not used as productively as it ought to be. It's not invested in those things that will drive the economy into the next century. So that's why it's a bad tax. And what is taxation all about? Well, it's about raising the amount of money a government needs to raise with the least disadvantage to the economy, accepting that the extraction of all taxation has to some extent a negative effect. But inheritance tax is particularly bad. It's also bad because it's not linked to a transaction, where income tax and VAT are. There is a cash transaction going through at which the government, Inland Revenue, HMRC, takes a bit. With inheritance tax, assets need to be sold, potentially at the wrong time in the cycle of the investment. It also raises comparatively little money, £7 billion, well under 1% of the total income received by the state each year. So you have a knock-on, a bigger economic effect for a low amount of tax, which is the definition of an inefficient form of taxation, and you get enormous efforts for people to try and get round it using the legitimate schemes that the government has invented, including on one occasion. I knew an old man who decided to get married to get round inheritance tax. It had a certain degree of success, though not necessarily entirely what he would have wanted. But that's another matter. So it is an inefficient, bad economic tax, but also the politics of it. Fascinatingly, although only 4 or 5% of estates pay the tax, 31% of people think that they will pay the tax. It's oddly an aspirational tax. People hope they will be well enough off that they'll be caught in the trap, and 15% of people think they'll get an inheritance that will be hit by it. So for scrapping a single tax that raises a small amount of money, the government gets a relatively big bang for its buck, and it would scrap something that Labour and the Lib Dems would be committed to reintroduce. And so if you think of all those people living in the south of the country who have houses that are valuable and children or grandchildren or nieces and nephews who they might like to leave it to, they will face a real choice at the next election if the Conservatives have got rid of it, because nobody else would do the same. Economically inefficient, politically powerful, it's time to scrap inheritance tax in the spring budget. As you know, as always, I want to hear from you, and as I said, it's a different email today. It's gbviews@gbnews.com.